Perfect. Well, welcome everyone officially to our Environmental Justice Roundtable. This is our first training for our new cohort of our next generation climate and health ambassadors. We have 35 awesome ambassadors who are young and emerging health professionals located all across the US. My name is Becca Phillips. As many of you know, I am a climate and health fellow here at PSR National. And I'm going to introduce our three speakers. We have Karthik Amarnath, Sara Arman, and Ans Irfan. Just so delighted, three absolutely wonderful individuals. So excited that they are here today. So I will read the bios and then ask question, and then the floor is yours. If you can have your camera on, as I said, awesome. But also know that many of you are busy and maybe in and out of clinical rotations. So no worries if not. So first up, we have Karthik Amarnath. Karthik is an aspiring clinician based in Brooklyn, New York, with a professional and academic background in environmental justice and critical urban studies. He is currently the regulatory director of the Mid-Atlantic region for Vote Solar, as well as a former policy specialist at Push Buffalo. The third culture kid of an Indo-Malaysian mother and a Sri Lankan Tamil father, he grew up in 4 countries. He spent a year as a Fulbright scholar in Kuala Lumpur studying environmental gentrification in his mother's childhood neighborhood of Brickfields, and was the former energy planner at the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, where he worked on energy policies and programs serving frontline communities. He has previously worked with the CDC, Democracy Now!, the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, and the Tishman Environment and Design Center. In 2021, he was named an Archival Creators Fellow with the South Asian American Digital Archive. His writing on public health, climate change, politics, and environmental justice has been published in Tides Magazine, Environmental Health News, The Guardian, Naked Capitalism, the Albany Times Union, and academic journals in law and medicine. So thrilled to have you back with us, Karthik. Thanks so much. Second, we have Sara Arman. Sara is a Chelsea, Massachusetts resident and a proud graduate of Chelsea Public Schools. She's currently the Director of Health Equity and Policy at Green Roots, where she works to address health disparities through community organizing and policy and identify connections between the built and natural environment and health outcomes. Sara is passionate about gender and racial justice, affordable housing, and local politics, and was involved with the Chelsea Pandemic Response Team and supported the development of mutual aid networks in Chelsea. As a community organizer, she's led several campaigns and projects, including a vaccine equity initiative, a project to reduce the SNAP gap in Chelsea, and manage the distribution of thousands of dollars in emergency assistance. Sara received her master's in urban planning from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and her undergraduate degree from Tufts University. Outside of work, Sara serves on the board of the Comunidades Enraizadas Community Land Trust, and previously served on the Chelsea Planning Board. Thank you so much, Sara, for being here. Really excited to have you. I'm just letting 2 more people in. Okay, finally, we have Ans Irfan. Ans is a multidisciplinary global public health expert with over a decade and a half of experience as a health equity strategist, both domestically and globally. As a pracademic, he has worked across cultures, continents, and countries, including Pakistan, China, and the United States since the early 2000s. He currently serves as an associate professor at the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California, where his teaching, research, and practice portfolio focuses on climate, justice, and health through a decolonial approach. He is also a religion and public health fellow at Harvard Divinity School, a part of Harvard Climate Entrepreneur Circle, and serves as the founding director of the Climate and Health Equity Practice Fellowship. As a critical public health scholar, he combines multiple disciplines, including environmental health, migrant health, climate change, sociocultural anthropology, and DEI, among others, to provide innovative interdisciplinary public policy and programmatic solutions geared towards ameliorating social and health inequities. Select recent projects include the intersection of religion and public health, traffic wardens and climate adaptation in Pakistan, evaluation of physicians' training on climate and health, and social equity implications of climate innovation at the intersection of technology and climate entrepreneurship. So those are our 3 wonderful speakers. One other note about housekeeping that I forgot. That's funny, Ans. Um, Please save your questions till the end, but we definitely encourage conversation in the chat. So if you want to comment at all, please do so, but we'll have plenty of times for questions at the end. Maybe if you want to write something down, that's great. All right, so my first question is for all of you. Maybe Karthik, if you want to take this first. So this is a question that I ask all of you ambassadors on our application. So I kind of want it to come first, full circle. So there is a very academic definition of environmental justice, but I'm curious if you could define environmental justice in your own terms, and then what in your personal or professional life has informed your understanding of it, or made it important to you. So Karthik, I'm gonna give you the microphone first.
Cool. Thanks, Becca. And so good to be with all of you. In terms of how to define environmental justice or what it means to me, I think my transnational background kind of has lent itself towards an understanding, for me at least, of environmental justice as an aspiration, a politic that is geared towards dismantling the oppressive legacies of racial capitalism and colonialism and patriarchy, with an understanding that we as humans are not separate from the environment, right? That we are part of wider ecosystems. The external environment is very much what sustains us and sustains society, and how we organize societies in relation to the environment modulates how we see oppression play out, right? And so, environmental justice brings the environment back towards understanding like a justice-oriented ethic. If that makes sense. And in terms of like what the second part of the question, I think what made environmental justice sort of like ossify in my head as something that was important and something that I had been yearning for a language around was, in addition to my own personal background, my father is the survivor of a civil war. My mother comes from a very racialized country in Southeast Asia. Our ancestors were involved in forced migration to sustain the booming automobile industry, particularly through rubber tapping in Malaysia. My ancestors were also the first people to experience the violence of Agent Orange. So in addition to that familial history, what brought it to the foreground for me was an experience I had with, it was an internship with a team of epidemiologists looking at the living and working conditions of migrant farm workers in South Georgia. And just witnessing the really stark violence, structural violence committed against the people who literally feed us, and how disparate what was happening on the ground was from the political discourse around these people and the very dehumanizing discourse around these people, that sort of like, I don't know, planted a seed of rage, I guess, that just has sustained me in terms of like my professional and intellectual pursuits. And like, in that study, we found that an overwhelming majority of the migrant farm workers that we interviewed experienced at least 3 symptoms of significant heat-related illness within the previous 7 days of the interview, when the interview was conducted, right? Not like in their lifetime or within the season, literally the prior 7 days, right? And so that was a prime example of how society organizes organizes itself again in relation to the environment, creating conditions in which certain populations are disproportionately exposed to violence, slow or acute violence. And yeah, ever since that experience, like I've never been able to, I don't mean to sound melodramatic, but I've never been able to look at a tomato the same. I still have dreams about it. And yeah, that's memories of that in addition to the very varying other experiences I've had, or what drive me and what inform my belief in this vision of what environmental justice is.
Thank you so much for sharing that very powerful, story as well. I'll jump to Sarah next if you want to share your experience.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. Hi, everyone. So nice to be here with you all. And thank you so much, Karthik, for sharing that. I really appreciated hearing about your experiences as well. For me, and I think at Green Roots, we really define environmental justice as like addressing and working against the constant burden that communities of color face, like constant environmental burdens. Communities of color, particularly in Chelsea and East Boston, but really across the state of Massachusetts and across the country and world, constantly have environmental hazards placed in their communities. There's constant industries and pollution and all these things always placed in communities of color and low-income communities, because people do not expect us to fight back, which is why organizations that do environmental justice work like Green Roots, like ACE, all these great organizations across the state are really important, because we have to constantly fight back against these things. I think for me, I came into the environmental justice movement through my lived experience as well. I grew up in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and I would take the bus to go to school, to go to work, and I took the bus for several years, and I would constantly see my community change around me, sometimes for better and a lot of times for worse. I would take the bus and see all this pollution and this smoke from the industries in Chelsea and East Boston. I would see a Starbucks come into our neighborhood. I would see all these huge apartment buildings being placed in, but not our community members who were living in them. So really thinking about how was my neighborhood and my environment changing, and why I felt like folks in my community who I was talking to on a regular basis were not being consulted or included in that decision-making process. So that's kind of where I entered environmental justice work from.
Thank you for sharing. And just a side note, I live in Boston, so it's really, really interesting to see what's happening in Chelsea, and just to have such a wonderful organization working on environmental injustices in that neighborhood. I'm going to pass it finally to Ans.
Hey y'all, can y'all hear me? Hi, good afternoon, good morning, depending on your time zone, wherever you are. Thank you for the invite. Really happy to be here. So environmental justice, I'll try to keep it as brief as I can. So it's sort of, I think part of it is the whole intellectual thing that we're forced to write these nauseating bios about ourselves. But a lot of it is deeply personal as well, right? So my context is that I grew up in a former colony in Pakistan, in a small village, in a farming family. So retrospectively, a lot of the water scarcity that then trickled down to crop yields, and that then trickled down to family dysfunction, was this broader function of all of these systems of oppression, as we academically love to call them. And now I'm acutely aware of my presence in the US as a settler colonial, and in this particular nation where we tend to use the past tense when it comes to indigenous people of this land. There's something to be said about acknowledging that positionality. So with that pretense and background in mind, so to me, environmental justice, it shifts and changes. And I actually appreciate, Becca, you asking that question, because I think we should be rejecting this tendency to find a universal definition, rather sticking with this plural understanding of how people think about different concepts, right? So to me, increasingly it has evolved and shifted over time. But as I understand at the moment, really, of course, like fairness and justice part is there. But whenever we're talking about it, is it leading to some form of structural change? Is I think like one of the things that I would I encourage myself to think about and be reflective about, and everyone else as well. And I say that to say that in the United States, and this is something that I'll come back to over and over again for the limited time that we have together. In the US, one of the things that I've noticed is that our thinking, because of this capitalistic system and neoliberal economy, has been reduced down to this binary thinking of Republican versus Democrats. And we're told to pick the lesser evil. But when you strip down Democrats' rhetoric, more often than not, you'll see that a lot of it is just rhetoric, right? Like Biden has done a lot of good stuff related to EJ, and I'll concede to that. But for the most part, much of it is just talk. And there's not a whole lot of distinction between what structural changes are they implementing, at the federal level, state level, or showing you the money, right? So I think like, so to me, when we talk about environmental justice, it's important to, highlight whatever inequities exist, but often the extent of our imagination, especially in academic capacity, is just observing for the sake of observing and saying the same thing with a sense of curiosity over and over again, and finding a new noun to describe something that people of color have been talking about centuries ago. And then sort of like, all of a sudden that new concept is going to be, that's what our mission statement is, right? But no one actually specifically highlights, well, who are the people who have power? Who are the people who are in decision-making capacity? And are we specifically pinpointing that you are the one who has power, right? So like I give that example of Democrats, not that Republicans smell like roses, and you don't have to agree with me politically, but Republicans are, when you look at environmental record, a anti-humanity party, right? So like there is no debate about that part when it comes to climate change. Democrats, on the other hand, they get away with a lot. And that's something that I would sort of really encourage you all to keep the political economy context in mind when we think about environmental justice. It's not to say to reject everything wholesale, but it is to say questioning things that are normalized and scrutinizing these definitions like environmental justice, right? So like, president could stand in front of a pretty podium and say they care about environmental justice, but end of the day, if the outcomes are the same, I'm not so sure how much of that was about environmental justice versus political rhetoric to appease the upper middle class of this country. So I'll zip it there.
Wow. all of you three, just there's so many questions that come from just that introductory question, which is very large. I want to kind of come back to the point of, being like practicing environmental justice rather than just having it be something performative. And I'd like to start with you, Sarah, because Green Roots is an environmental justice organization. And I'm curious, just in practice, what are some ways that you've really fought some of the hurdles that, in terms of like excluding the community and certain regulatory practices and other obstacles that you're facing against some of the environmental injustices in Chelsea, and how can we actually empower communities, frontline communities, to become agents of change in this environmental justice work?
Sure. Yeah, that's a big question. But Green Roots is a member-led community organization, which means that we have a membership of people who, there's no strict definition, there's no payment system to become a member, but it's anybody who lives, works, hangs out in the Chelsea and East Boston communities can be a member, or even cares about those two communities. And so we're membership-led, which means that we prioritize our members in everything that we do. We don't decide what we're doing and then get our members' input on it, but rather we're really looking towards our community members to identify the problems in the community, to guide us and to tell us what they think the priorities are. And some days that's really challenging. So for example, earlier this week, a lot of our members were complaining about this huge development coming up on a specific street in Chelsea. So we stopped what we were doing, went there, door knocked, organized people, talked to them, and now we're holding a community meeting next week specifically for them to raise their concerns to our interim city manager and to the city councilors. So a lot of it has to do with flexibility. Like, are you willing to put aside what the grants are saying and what your ego is saying and what you think is important, and really prioritize what folks on the ground, folks in the community are saying to you? I think that's a really key one. And I think one challenge we're specifically fighting against right now is the Eversource substation in East Boston. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. A substation is kind of like an electrical generating station. We've been fighting Eversource on this project for several years at this point. Part of our strategy is sometimes litigation. We really look towards our partners at Conservation Law Foundation or Lawyers for Civil Rights to like bring up court cases against folks, but also really organizing folks on the ground. We've held numerous rallies, held door knocking efforts, got people together to speak out against this substation. Fortunately, it's still going on. It looks like they're about to break ground soon, but really continuing fighting against this substation is a really big deal. One of the key reasons why we're fighting against this substation is not just because we don't want it there, but what we've heard and what we know as community members is that there's this really huge park nearby. There's a park where so many East Boston residents play in, where they have soccer practices, where they have games, and it's such an important community location. Having a substation next to it will, one, pollute the air even worse than it already is. East Boston is a community that already has so much burden from hosting Logan Airport, from holding all of the fuel for the entire state, from hosting numerous industrial activities, industrial sites, right? What we've heard from residents is that enough is enough. They do not want any more. In addition, substations are really dangerous. It's located on a flood zone on the Chelsea Creek. It's a site that can flood, that can catch on fire. It's dangerous for the 50,000 East Boston residents who live in a really compact, dense urban area. So really pushing, thinking about what is good for these residents, what do they want to see, and what they want is clean neighborhoods with breathable air where they and their kids can go out and play and have a good time. And so for us, it's really a question of how are we letting residents lead, but also making sure that we're not burdening them with doing extra work. Because at the same time, we know that our communities are full of people who are working 2 to 3 jobs just to make ends meet, right? So at times it's like we also have to take the lead, but make sure that everything we're doing is in line and influenced and informed by our community members.
Thank you so much. And also, if you are in Boston, I know we have a few different ambassadors there. I encourage you to go see there is active protests in that area near the substation. And I've been there, and it literally is right near the creek. Like it will 100% flood. So yeah, it's a huge issue. It
has flooded before.
Yeah, it has flooded before, exactly. So yeah, it's a really upsetting to see that there. I want to ask Karthik a little bit more about kind of the practical elements of energy justice. And, I know that Sarah spoke a lot about kind of industry and different substations and pollutants in the area. But I know that you've done a lot of work in energy justice in New York City, and that you're currently the regulatory director of Vote Solar. I know that's a new position, but I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more about energy justice and how that plays a role in environmental justice and a just transition. I know a few questions.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. The energy system, just like various other sectors of the economy, such as housing, has been a site of racialized politics and planning, right? And that's created disproportionate burdens for people of color, indigenous people, working class people. Try and rattle off some facts quickly, I guess. I think epidemiologists and environmental health scientists have suggested that living within a 30-mile radius of a coal or oil-fired power plant will lead to significant negative health impacts. 7 out of 10 Black people live within that radius nationally. At the same time, for this $41 billion industry, according to the Association for Blacks in Energy, 0.01% of revenues generated from that industry go to Black people. And so you have this catch-22 where disproportionate exposure to the toxicity of the system is not at all paired with any sort of economic benefit, right? People are literally extracting wealth from these communities. And so, and the energy system is not the only, by any means, is not the only significant contributor to violence against people of color, but it is a primary one. And, the challenge for environmental justice practitioners is that, like what Sarah was talking about, is there's a lot of need to respond rapidly to the bad that keeps happening. The system continues to reproduce itself, right? At the same time, how do we proactively introduce mechanisms to undo the bad and create the new, right? No one is anti-energy. It's more about how can we transition from an economy writ large that is extractive, that is literally extracting wealth from communities in the form of health and financial extraction, et cetera. How do we transition from that extractive economy to a regenerative one that can address historic harms that communities have faced? In my work, Sarah was talking about a substation in a flood zone, which it's very similar to some of my experiences in New York. I can just give one example, right? So there's this massive area of central Brooklyn, which has a population that probably outnumbers most cities in the United States, where the local utility, Con Edison, expected an energy shortage. And this area, if you drew the boundaries of this area that was projected to have an energy shortage, so not enough electricity will flow to these areas during extreme weather moments, like a heat wave, for example. This is the first area, disproportionately an area with communities of color and working class people. This is the place where shutoffs are going to happen first and worst, right? We mapped heat vulnerability throughout New York City, and literally the boundaries of where the shortage is going to be totally were in sync with the area of New York City that had the highest heat vulnerability index, right? At the same time, this area of central Brooklyn had a lot of significant, what were called significant maritime industrial areas. So a lot of polluting industries, and they were located along the waterfront. So in an extreme weather event, not only are you projected to have an energy shortfall in this area where people can't cool their homes, for example, or stay in their homes even, but during an extreme weather event that involves floods, there's going to be significant amounts of toxic exposure, right? Now, the state of New York worked with Con Edison to come up with a solution to this energy shortfall, and it involved $500 million going to the utility, and that money came from ratepayers, working people paying their utility bills. The state handed over $500 million to Con Edison to come up with a solution. We proposed an idea called inclusive financing, which essentially was a financial model that would undo the way things have run in the past. If you talk about housing, for example, like you need a good credit score in order to get it, in order to have access to a lot of the housing that's available, you need upfront capital. There are all of these sort of racialized ways of excluding people of color. That housing system plays a role in the energy system too. So we were trying to put forth a financial model that could basically use this $500 million as seed capital to transform central Brooklyn and address legacies of redlining that caused housing and buildings in communities of color in this area to be energy efficient, to be vulnerable to extreme weather. There's a lot of dilapidated housing because of legacies of redlining, right? And unfortunately, we were completely ignored, and the $500 million essentially went to auctions where big businesses like hospital systems, for example, could bid to receive that money if they promised to reduce their electricity consumption for a couple days out of the year, right? So that's how capital is being used, like working people's capital is being used as opposed to what could happen, which is implementing innovative kinds of models that create opportunities for people to actually, withstand what's coming. And yeah, I think the fight now is to sort of like expand the vision for a lot of these like old white men. Hopefully they just die out and we can replace them with people who can have more of a visionary approach. But yeah, implementing models that are mindful of histories of injustice and trying to undo those histories. That makes sense.
That definitely makes sense. And that's appalling, the story you told me, the 500 million being given to the hospitals and they just lowered electricity. That's wow. Well, anyways, that actually leads right into another question I have, kind of zooming out in terms of all of you have spoken a little bit about how we can't talk about environmental justice without thinking about all these different systems of oppression like colonialism and racism and imperialism that have impacted environmental injustices. And Ans, I know you do a lot of interdisciplinary work, a lot about looking at it from a decolonial lens. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to these different legacies and how we can start to work to dismantle these systems and just create a dialogue around this in our conversations and our practices of environmental justice.
If my computer allows it. Yeah, I just want to say like hashtag retweet or however it works. Like I'm not too social media savvy of both what Karthik and Sarah have been talking about. I think the thing that I would add to that really is, again, what I was talking about earlier, this notion of rejecting binary, which I would really, really encourage you all to try to internalize it as much as you can and think about that all the things that are normalized around us, right? So like, and how those things then get sold both through our political leadership, as well as our media, our nonprofit leadership, the so-called nonprofit industrial complex, and so on and so forth, right? So like, where we just take their word as is and then run with it, right? So like, we don't scrutinize those particular terms. So when people throw around terms like environmental justice is a classic example of it, right? When the end of the day, the extent of their imaginative capacity is individual level things that people can do, as opposed to saying that, well, there's only limited capacity that people can engage in this action. Here are the systems and structures that need to be changed and dismantled. So I think there's something to be said about rejecting that binary and realizing that much of it is the political discourse around climate change at this point is a total scam, and these folks are just selling snake oil, right? So like there are very few models. In fact, like there was this interview by the Secretary General of the UN who was saying that there's like it would take a miracle to keep us below 1.5 degrees centigrade, right? But when you ask the people who are in charge of our climate response, Secretary John Kerry, he's the climate czar, his literal response is this literal unicorn thinking, which he basically said, and this is his quote, that technology that's going to fix climate change does not yet exist. So basically that in the future, there's going to be this magical technology that is going to somehow fix climate change, right? So it's coming from him, and that's why we're just sort of like, there were all sorts of news coverage that we need to focus on technology, right? I'm working on a project actually thinking about climate innovation and technology, but no one scrutinizes that particular policy thinking. Like you are literally telling me that magically some technology is going to come in the future and that's going to fix it. But if the similar sort of like, way of saying that, the same thing had come from an indigenous group, people of color, stating that we need to go back to XYZ ways of engaging with the world, such as cutting our consumption drastically, or not driving, or maybe not having private jets, or any number of those structural foundational changes, how we engage with the world, that would have been an outraged and a childish way of thinking, right? But just because it's coming from the status quo, all of a sudden we are okay with that particular mentality, right? So now all this to say that scrutinizing that part, in my view, is really, really important. And the other thing, I'm not gonna take us on that, get on that soapbox and go through that other discursive side of things and speak in this a lot of academic lingo. But what I do want to say is, these systems there's no evil magical being sitting behind these systems who is producing and reproducing these systems of oppression and all sorts of challenges that we talked about. You and I make these systems, and always be mindful of it and remember that part, right? So and a lot of times people like myself, because they fall at different intersectionalities, be it gender queerty or migrant status or linguistic ability or being neurotypical or not, and so on and so forth. The list goes on and on and on. But we are invited into those rooms because we're already part of a certain social class, and that deference is given to us, right? Like there's this philosopher at Georgetown who talks about this notion of deference politics, where the idea there really is that social elites invite people of color, let's say, use a broader category, who already have a certain degree of privilege, right? So, and end of the day, the solutions that we produce are this sort of like pronoun politics of sorts, right? So I don't fit the binary of the he, she. So I totally get it, absolutely important. Pronouns are a matter of my dignity, but if the extent of your imagination is let's fix the pronouns, or things like very intellectual academic things like citational justice, right? We need to cite Black and brown scholars. Of course, that's important, but how does that get clean water to people in Flint, Michigan, right? So how does that get food to people in Yemen starving because of our sanctions, right? So how does that get sort of any type of climate adaptation interventions across the world, right? So that part, so I say that all to say that all of you either are or will be in a decision-making capacity before you know it. And at that point, then you get to make a choice whether or not you're going to perpetuate that system and justify. We are very good at telling ourselves these fancy, pretty little stories to convince ourselves that we're doing, proverbially speaking, God's work and environmental justice work, right? So we can convince ourselves of just about anything, right? But there's if you cannot be honest with anyone else, and I get it, money is important and we all got to pay our bills, be honest with yourself and ask yourself this question every day. Are you doing stuff that's going to lead to some sort of structural change? Or are you just perpetuating the status quo, but you've learned the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion to just sprinkle over whatever we're talking about?
Thank you so much. And that is a really powerful question. So thank you for that.
Can I just jump in, Becca? I wanted to build off of what Ans was saying. Yeah, thanks, Ans. That was that was super informative, and I appreciate everything you said. I think the one thing I would add on, kind of building off of what you said, is that a lot of times people reach out to environmental justice organizers like Green Roots or Alternatives for Community Environment, all these organizations, and they're sustainability groups. And I think there's this really key difference between this concept of personal sustainability and personal responsibility and action versus being out in your community organizing folks. It's kind of easy to say oh, I'm not going to use a plastic straw, I'm going to use a paper straw today instead, and buy all these nice paper straws and buy all these nice new Tupperware for your homes that are sustainable or whatever. It's a lot more difficult to be on the ground organizing folks, setting up community meetings, developing these long-lasting, long-term relationships with folks so that you can create that structural change, because it's definitely not something that's going to happen overnight. It's definitely something that's going to take years and decades.
Yeah, thank you so much for adding that. It is a lot of work just organizing, and I know all of you have played organizing roles. I did want to zoom out a little bit, or not really zoom out, but talk a little bit about health and the intersection between health equity, and just all of us here are young and emerging health professionals. All of you panelists have interdisciplinary backgrounds with climate and health. So this is a question for all of you about the importance of, as health professionals, we are trusted messengers of information. We do have a lot of privilege and power in what we do. But I also remember last year, Karthik, you recommended this wonderful book to me called Inflamed. And it's all about the oppressive roots of illness. So I'm curious, and I have been reading it, so thank you so much for that recommendation. I'm curious how you all think that as health practitioners, we can learn to treat the oppressive roots of illness and integrate justice into our practices or into community organizing in different ways, and really use our privilege to be agents of change. And any one of you can take this. If none of you want to, I can find someone to speak up. Yeah.
I can jump in first and then pass it off. I think for us, we really see there's like deep connections between health and the environment. I think there's like some of the very obvious connections, like if there's more pollution in your air, you will probably trigger asthma or other respiratory illnesses. But it's even broader than that. Having access to green space and a clean and healthy and safe environment is something that really improves people's mental health. There's also other connections between mold and mental health. If you have mold or dampness in your home, you're more likely to experience anxiety and depression. So I feel like those are very clear connections between us. But I think it goes even broader than that, right? Environmental justice is about what is in your environment and how are we going to keep people in these improving environments. A really big part of environmental justice for me is anti-displacement, making sure that when these nice things come in our communities, like these parks and these improved buses and apartments, that people are able to stay in that community and benefit from all these improvements. That's a really key piece for us. And I think, another part that also jumps out to me about health and environmental justice is like the concept of food justice. Do people have access to healthy and nutritious food in their communities? Is it growing in their communities? Do they have access to a supermarket? All of these things are really important. I think there are really clear ways that physicians and other healthcare professionals can be involved in the environmental justice movement. I think one thing I've heard a lot from our community members is that they'll go to the hospital and the doctor will tell them, you should diet and exercise and go on a walk. But the sidewalk infrastructures in Chelsea is crumbling. There are no parks. Only 4% of our community is green space. So it's not like they can go on this hour-long walk at a beautiful location. So definitely keeping in mind that health is not just like what the doctor is telling you to do, but it's really this environmental, social, economic thing that's influencing people's health outcomes. That's one key way. I think the other key way is I think healthcare professionals have a really powerful voice and have these credentials from these institutions that people listen to and should be using that for good. When there are policies and legislation that we're working on, like air quality or other things, can we get a coalition of healthcare professionals to come out and support that, to come to our rallies, to sign on to our letters to the governor and to legislators? Those are all really key ways that healthcare professionals can be directly involved. I'll pass it to Ans, maybe. I see you nodding.
Sure. Yeah, I would just say, this idea of coalition building, of course, it's an important one, but I think the starting point of that should really be the X community that you're talking about, right? Like, and it should not be, how we approach, or by we, I mean the normative understanding within the Western context of what health is, or what well-being is, or what certain ways of thinking around these issues are, right? So like and again, going back to this idea of decoloniality, then how do we rethink our current approach to any of these particular issues? So I'll just share this very quick example. Pakistan, those of you who are familiar with it may know. Those who are not, I'll just briefly say that it's a theocratic state. It's predominantly Muslim, and thanks to the Western intervention, particularly the United States, at a particular point, they further entrenched that theocracy into their legal system. A gift that keeps on giving. Again, I'll highlight, underscore it one more time, thanks to American intervention. So in that particular context, if you want to talk about health, so one of the projects I worked on was both related to brick factory workers as well as transgender community in this small geographical area within Pakistani context. And in that particular context, we did not end up using the Western framing of what health is, right? So like, so we were not going out this individual right to health, but rather this Islamic way of thinking, which was a Muslim understanding of this collective well-being and taking care of the community. And that particular framing, which was polar opposite of this human rights framing of transgender rights, ended up leading to Pakistan passing one of the most progressive laws related to transgender protections, where you have right to inheritance, you have right to protect yourself against discrimination in employment. You can walk up to a national ID office and mark your gender as the third gender, which has been the historical understanding in that particular context. So I say long-winded way of saying that, of course, that part is important, but as healthcare professionals, we also need to have intellectual humility to know what we don't know and realize that other folks have different ways of thinking, which may not fit in our mental model whatsoever. So having the intellectual humility to start with that starting point where the community is becomes really, really important to then sort of come up with richer interventions as opposed to only signing off on the ones that fit within this Eurocentric way of thinking, right? So yeah, Karthik, all yours.
Yeah, I don't know what to add. I think what's important for you all as healthcare professionals in training, for you all to understand, is that the symptoms you see in the clinic are part of a continuum. They're the product of structural conditions, injustices. You know, that book that Becca mentioned, I believe it was co-authored by a physician at UCSF. And one of the things they say is that the current medical model approaches illness as if doctors were, I think, biotechnical engineers, right? Seeing the problem as one of like, what are the elements here and how do we manipulate the situation in order to produce better symptomological outcomes. And that doesn't get to the structural roots of what created the health insults you'll see in the clinic in the first place, you know, and they are insults, right? They shouldn't be accepted and tolerated. So yeah, I would suggest like read that book. And you know, like the others said, there are so many creative ways that healthcare practitioners can get involved. I think an important thing to recognize is, despite the way we place physicians, especially on a pedestal, when it comes to this stuff, humility is super important. And you know, just because you can pass a unit in preclinical years does not mean that you know how the world works or how health injustice shows up in the communities that you serve. I think humility is really important, following the direction of the people who are experiencing the symptoms that you're treating, right? Empowering your patients, listening to what they have to say, and then going from there. Where are resources available that can facilitate structural change locally? One example is that through the Affordable Care Act, each hospital system has been granted like millions of dollars for community health initiatives. And we're not really having many conversations about how that money is being spent. And if so, who's making the decisions around how that money is spent, right? Chances are not much decision-making is coming from the communities that are immediately adjacent to these massive hospital systems, many of which are in low resource settings, right? The hospital system is also, I think, top 5 worst emitter in the United States, right? Like, that's simply unacceptable, because emissions equate to unnecessary and premature death. That's what that means. So is the medical system actually saving lives, or what's going on there, right? And like, that's not to convey some sort of like, I don't mean to I don't mean to be a downer. It's I'm pointing out these situations as opportunities, right? That the clinical workforce, if organized, can really tap into and do some profound stuff with, become interlocutors between the immense amount of resources and the social capital, whether justified or not, that clinicians get, facilitate opportunities for all of that to be operationalized under the direction and leadership of the very people who you are treating, especially if they come from communities of color, low-income communities, working class communities, gender non-conforming communities. Yeah, just be humble.
Today, I'm just gonna add to what Karthik just mentioned, that I totally mean to be a downer when it comes to physicians. Like I think like there is this unnecessarily unwarranted and unearned prestige that is associated with that particular title when you earn your MD, that there's no excuse for it, right? So like, and at the governance level, which, maybe maybe you don't, is one of the major structural determinants of health. We entrench that, right? Because like these are the people who have historically held lobbying power. It's like AMA is part of the reason we don't have universal healthcare, right? So like it's like the leading physician advocacy organization. And then these physicians end up being the leaders in public health. So a lot of states and cities, including the federal government, have literal laws that you need to have an MD to run a public health department. I have one, and for that reason, I know that there is very little that is touched upon that has something to do with public health. Those are incredibly different fields. They're relevant, they're adjacent, but they're completely different, right? So end of the day, their decision-making then ends up reflecting in the policies, which are always reduced down to what Karthik was mentioning earlier. There's like technologist of sorts, right? So like individual level behavior change, because that's what we're trained as physicians to do. And then policies are always, wear your mask or wash your hands or whatever, as opposed to these structural changes that are necessary. So yeah, absolutely. Question these people and question those policies and think about how to change those. Even when you're cashing on it, I would say those of you are going to end up being physicians.
And question your profession.
I appreciate just the constant questioning, and it makes me think a lot. I think I'm going to have this be that last question because Karthik, I know you have to leave at 3. So I want to leave now time for open questions for all of our ambassadors. If you just want to raise your hand, type in the chat. The floor is now yours. And thank you for being here, for me moderating. But now all of you, please ask away. Or just we can have a conversation. We have a collective conversation as well.
I can start if that's okay. I was going to raise my hand, but I don't know how to do it, although I just figured it out. Okay. Thank you all for being here. I think one of the things that came up is this idea that we, as a lot of us are academics, a lot of times we are spinning our wheels and kind of just reinventing the wheel. We are gathering data to prove things that we already know. My question is, in a space where a lot of our institutions want to see the data and want to know, and our governments want to know what the path flow for money is before they're willing to actually intervene, right? So if you can make a case that says we can save money by helping people not die because of climate change, that's the only way to actually get people to make a move. So how do academics and academic researchers, how do we partner with community groups or anyone else to actually try to move the needle on that and actually translate our research and our work into real policy and real change?
You want to go? You can go for it.
I can chime in. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I'm happy to comment on it. Such that I think I'll take it back to that whole thing I keep going back to, and I know I sound like a broken record and probably quite obnoxious, keep saying that change the system, where there's nothing new, right, about it. But I think like depending on the context, like that change the system reflects in this sort of like, bite-sized steps that we can take. And in the academic context, for instance, I'll share just a very personal example of it, which is that historically, my profile has tracked very well with the tenure track, if you will, given that I'm just unnecessarily overeducated for no good reason other than that I like learning. But I've actively rejected that tenure track system within the faculty capacity. And my rationale there really was more philosophical than a practical one. And philosophical really is that tenure system is designed to have you conform to the status quo bit by bit by bit by bit. So every year you sell a part of your soul, and end of the day, now I am a tenured faculty member and I have all the protections, but now I am the system, right? So all this to say that within academic capacity, in my view, a good starting point is putting pressure on these tenured folks and the academic leadership from within organizations, from outside the organizations, that what is it that they are doing in their capacity now that they have the safety network, which is sold as, because academia is a pyramid scheme, right? So it's like it's sold as this sort of like, this glamorous thing, but end of the day, it's a neoliberal capitalistic hellhole. So I think like that's one way of sort of like putting pressure on these particular folks. And the second thing really is that one of the things that I'm working on here at USC, where I'm a faculty member here, for instance, is to anytime they talk about, this is probably going to get me fired, who cares? Life is short. So these folks are, like now they're working on, they got this fancy little grant from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and it's really well intentioned, the kind of work that they're trying to do. So in my capacity, I'm pushing them to move past what an individual faculty member can do versus what the policy says, right? So like, for instance, I'm explicitly trying to have a work group that is going to focus on tenures and promotions related criteria, and explicitly incorporate community engaged work in it in a tangible, meaty way beyond this performative check mark that it exists at the moment, right? Because currently it says that, did you do service? And that service includes all sorts of community engaged work. And, you can sit there, no offense to any of you all who are researchers, I love you all dearly, but you could sit there and write your little paper and that's it, right? Well, community engaged work takes so much more effort, both financial, mental, cognitive, and so on and so forth. But when you get evaluated, that is this tiny little check mark and half a sentence that you put in there because that's the space that's left there, right? So now one of the ways that I'm having them sort of like rethink that entire tenures and promotion way of thinking about how we promote, how we recruit, how we retain faculty is that explicitly stating, it's not to say that creating false dichotomy between research versus community engaged stuff. In my view, all research should be applied and community engaged. But I get it, some people are more interested in research part. But I think like those, again, going back to those structures and guidelines become an important starting point to rethink that part. And anytime these people come up with a new fancy title of, I don't know, Dean of Social Justice and Equity, just ask the person, what are you going to do? Right. So like, and it takes, because a lot of times, like, I don't need you to write another fancy statement. And a lot of times I don't need your mentorship. I need your money. So it's sort of like, it's sort of that part. And then really questioning these folks in those rooms when they're trying to do community engagement within the community and have a conversation, right? Like, why do I have to have another conversation about a conversation we had in 2019 about racial equity, right? So like, why don't you all change your damn guidelines now, and then we'll take it from there. So anyway, so I think that's one small starting point to move away from this vicious neoliberal thing that we know as academia.
Yeah.
I have to run, but just real quick, I think maybe letting go of the results and focusing on process might be helpful. I think, the responsibility of an academic as an interlocutor within an institution that's inherently neoliberal and oppressive is how can we shift resources in a way that allows for the self-determination of communities that have been left out and extracted from. And so when it comes to a research agenda, for example, ensuring that whatever community is in question is meaningfully consulted and makes the decisions around each phase of the research process. And when that happens, you're in constant dialogue with a group of people who set the agenda and ultimately will set the agenda around how the research will be used. And they obviously have a stake in the game, right? Especially if they're willing to engage. And so, in doing that, you're already in a microcosm kind of way, recreating a structure within the institution, right? Allowing for the flow of resources, intellectual, financial, and otherwise. And I think that's where the responsibility lies. And then you leave the rest to the leadership of the very people in question. Please feel free to reach out if I can be of help in any way. I'm sorry that I have to run early, but it's been such a pleasure. Take care,
Thank you,
everyone.
Karthik. And is it okay if I give everyone your email address?
Yeah, no problem at all.
Awesome. Thank you so
All right.
much.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in as well, and thank you both for Karthik and Ans for you guys for saying that. Definitely agree. Environmental justice isn't just about the outcome, but it's definitely about the process of engaging folks. And a lot of times, researchers will come to communities like Chelsea and East Boston, and they want to survey a bunch of people and ask all these in-depth questions and intimate questions about their lives and take apart and collect some samples or whatever, and they're not offering a honorarium or a stipend for their time. They're not bringing childcare. They're not bringing language interpretation or translating the materials so folks understand what they're consenting to and what they're doing. So I think a little bit of like the question to always ask yourself in that situation is like, is what I'm doing materially improving the lives of the people who I'm supposedly trying to serve with this research project? Yeah, I think that's the key question. I think one thing that we've tried to do, like all the community-based organizations in Chelsea have tried to do, is like kind of block off researchers from being able to access community members so freely, because it's really not fair for them to be agreeing to someone collecting some type of DNA from them and not really understanding what they're consenting to because they actually don't speak English or because they don't read and you had your consent form written in a written way and not a verbal way. So definitely thinking about those details of how you're engaging with people and why you're engaging with them, and if it's actually going to improve their lives, or is it just like this extractive thing that will, I don't know, define someone's thesis or research project.
Thank you all.
Thank you for the question, Effie. We have time for a few more questions if people have any. I actually have another question if nobody else has one. It's about policy and the intersection between policy, health equity, and environmental justice. And I'm curious, especially you, Sarah, how you think that, how you've used policy to leverage, just your own community work. And then for people who are not that well versed in policy, how can we incorporate policy work and kind of learn to use that to make social change?
Sure, yeah. So we've used policy work in a couple of different ways. We've had a lot of successes in the past couple of years. One key success we've had in Massachusetts is being able to define what an environmental justice population is at the state level and have it written into law. This is a huge success because it provides us with like the ground or like the framework we need to then bring up other litigation against folks who are violating environmental protection laws across the state. So being able to clearly identify who is a part of an environmental justice community, So that's been a really great success for us. We're currently pushing a couple of different bills in the State House this year. One of them is a act to improve indoor and outdoor air quality for communities that are burdened by pollution. And this bill at the state level will expand outdoor air monitoring for black carbon, ultrafine particulate matter, and also set and achieve air quality targets by 2030 and by 2035. And it will also require the installation of air filters in certain buildings like schools or residential buildings with more than 2 units, as well as correctional facilities. And one really cool thing that it does is also update the state sanitary code to be able to improve like mold enforcement, which is like something that is not super enforced by the Department of Public Health currently. So that's one bill that we're working on. And the second piece of the second bill that I'm working on right now is an act to improve the to create siting improvement. And basically what that is like, how do we decide where an industrial factory or something gets placed in Massachusetts? So right now, there's obviously so many of them in Chelsea and East Boston, but we're trying to set criteria to say that if somewhere is an environmental justice community, which we laid out in the law last session, then we cannot place more burdens there because they already have enough burden in those communities. So it will include environmental justice and public health and climate as criteria to evaluate for the state siting board, which is really cool. I definitely think there's really exciting ways for folks to get involved in both and on all of this kind of legislation, which is like being directly involved with environmental justice organizations across the region or in your own local communities, wherever you are, is really important. Being able to support them, whether that's through phone banking or door knocking or outreach to legislators or whatever that is, or using your privilege and your education and your credentials to really push along this legislation as well. And I think the key thing, we were in a meeting yesterday for the air quality bill where someone suggested like we should get all these doctors to come out and speak, and I was like, that's great, but at the same time remembering that this is most like we should be centering and uplifting the people who are most impacted by this, like who are the folks in our community whose asthma is constantly triggered by the pollution in places like Chelsea and East Boston, and how can we really put them as like the spokespeople and have the focus on them and make sure that they're the ones who feel the most empowered to speak. So definitely being able to support things, but also knowing when the right time is to step back.
Thank you for that. And I think it is a tricky balance between, stepping back and centering other voices. So I thank you for that. Any final questions?
If I ask a question,
Yeah.
I was just wondering, I think there is in the advocacy world, there is and activism as well, there's a lot of burnout, and I'm wondering what you do to try to continue to be motivated and reduce compassion fatigue and general burnout.
That's a great question.
You want to start, or should I jump in?
Please go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me, organizing is very exhausting and can be really tiring work. But at the same time, like I think working in the community in which I grew up, the community that's home for me, and like seeing the constant like resilience and joy of my community members, like despite these tremendous burdens, is like something that's really inspiring and keeps me motivated. And then there's like other practical things we do, like for example, Green Roots doesn't work on Fridays. We have a 4-day work week, which is really nice because I have a 3-day weekend every weekend. So that's like one really concrete way, but more spiritually and emotionally nourishing is like being able to connect with my community members and know that what I'm doing is in service of them and of our collective needs and the collective good.
For me, food really helps. I love food. It's my eternal love. I probably shouldn't be saying this with this particular audience, but a lot of the food that I consume is unhealthy, but it's good for my soul. So food is really helpful. And I think beyond that material thing, I think just for me, it's always the question of all the privileges that I enjoy today are a function of people who fought and died centuries ago. and I'll never know their names, right? So like, so to me, it's always a reminder for myself that it's about posterity. It's not about me. It's not about my legacy. I'm dead and gone. I'm plant food, thankfully, and seen enough of it. And but it is about just paying forward for all, because it's for we think on short term, right? So like, and it's easier to get bogged down with this like tiny petty little things. But again, like as I was saying, that I come from a former colony, and implied in it is that a lot of people fought and died to make that a former colony, right? So like I am a professor in the United States. It's not because I'm also brilliant or whatever. It is because all those other people who fought and died to make sure that I had that right, predominantly Black people, right? So like, I'm a migrant to this country, and I was never part of those struggles within the US context, but then there was this other group of people who I owe that to, right? So like, so for me, it's a much deeper philosophical question, that it is about posterity, and that also allows you to kind of move away from a lot of the capitalistic bullshit of careers, and just being very cautious and careful about what you say, and filter everything, because America loves nothing more than respectability politics, and those get reinforced how you talk, what you say, what word you say, and so on and so forth. So we could go out and kill and do mass murder through our imperialism, and that's fine. But the moment you say the wrong word, it's sort of like, use the cuss word, right? So go on. And that's part of the reason I think deeper in my subconscious, I've tried to diversify my work portfolio, so I don't have to subjugate myself to the whims of liberal elites. So yeah, I think it is about posterity, just reminding myself that I owe my existence to a lot of the people across the world in so many different ways that I'll never be able to account for. And just want to do my part to maybe leave it a little bit better, especially in this context, as America is going nosedive towards fascism, and we're not realizing it just yet.
I always appreciate just the honesty and just, yeah, I appreciate both of you and your insightful responses. Any other questions? We have like 1 minute, but I don't know if you all want to stay on for longer. And I know that 2 new ambassadors just joined us, so welcome.
Hi, Becca. I'm just gonna say, Brianna, oh my God, hi.
Hi. Sorry, I had an earlier commitment, but I was like, oh my God, I had to hop on to see if you were still here.
This is brighten up my day. Oh my God.
Dr. Irfan and I, go ahead.
Go ahead, my apologies.
Oh, I was gonna say, we were in our MPH program together at UW. So we had a class together several years ago, but he has gone on to do incredible things. So it's exciting to see him in this context and talking to all of us. So thanks for being here.
Country girl trying to stay above water, but Brianna is definitely one of the smartest people I know. And when you talk about community engaged work, that's actually impactful, both from engagement perspective, doing the research, and then translating into tangible policies and practices. Dr. Vinoy is all yours. So it's in that regard. Thank you, Brianna. So wonderful to see you. Anyways, sorry, folks, for digressing. I couldn't resist.
That's such a wonderful, wow. I'm so glad that you were able to come on, Brianna. Any other final thoughts or questions or anything before we wrap up? I appreciate all of you for your time, our speakers and also ambassadors. And I've seen your project proposals and just as things that you're doing in your own communities, and they inspire me. So thank you all for being here. And thank you, Sara and Ans and Karthik, even though Karthik had to leave. All right, I think we'll wrap up at that. I'm gonna stop the recording, and everyone, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much.
I'll keep in touch and reach out if I can be helpful in any capacity, even if it's just bouncing off ideas. And very nice to meet you, Sara, and everyone else, and hope to be in touch. Be well, y'all. Be kind and gentle with yourself. That's the most important part. Take care, y'all. Bye.
Likewise. All right. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.